Hello, my name is Rachel Lovett. I'm the curator and assistant director at the historic Hammond-Harwood House Museum in downtown Annapolis, Maryland. I'm going to be bringing a series of different topics on our research that I have been working on while we've been closed due to COVID-19. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about an architectural feature at the Hammond-Harwood House. Hammond-Harwood House is really an architectural jewel in terms of American architecture. One of the more interesting features on the house is one of the windows called a Gibbs surround. And so today I'll be doing a talk on the Gibbs surround. Now, with this particular topic, I have also put a link into this video, and you can follow along with my research. And there's also a series of images there, so you can follow directly along as I am speaking. So if you've ever noticed the elegant window that graces the stair hall at the Hammond-Harwood House, you might wonder where the design came from. So this post will talk about where it came from and why our architect may have included it into the house. The design is known as a Gibbs surround, and it's included on windows and doorways. And it contains protruding rectangular blocks that are either made of stone or wedges made to look like stone. And in both instances, the surfaces are roughened through a process known as rustication. Typically, there is a pediment on top and a keystone down below, and adjoining voussoirs to support. The style takes its name from Scottish-born architect James Gibbs, who lived from 1682 to 1754. He studied in Rome and worked primarily in England. The style was based on ancient Roman antiquity, and it was around centuries before James Gibbs. However, he was the one to popularize it in England and the colonies. The benefit Gibbs had from his training abroad gave him an advantage over his competition. He was well versed in the Baroque style as well as the work of 16th century Italian architects Andrea Palladio and Sebastiano Serlo. Many of his buildings contain a Gibbs surround, and the design can be found in Gibbs' popular publication, A Book of Architecture, which he published in 1728. Despite contemporaries copying the form, the style bears his name, which attests to his influence. Most notably, Gibbs' work can be found on the church St. Martin's in the Fields in London, designed in 1720, which contains a large quantity of Gibbs surrounds. This building became a model for churches in Britain and America well into the 19th century. But why is there a Gibbs surround window at the Hammond-Harwood House? The question can be answered in examining the life and times of the man who designed the house. The architect of the Hammond-Harwood House is a man by the name of William Buckland, who lived from 1734 to 1774. He grew up in the University City of Oxford, England, a place steeped in classical architecture. By the year of his birth in 1734, the city already had over 25 classical buildings modeled after ancient Greek and Roman structures. The first classical building, the Sheldonian Theatre, was built in 1664 and was soon followed by others. Great architects like Sir Christopher Wren and Nicholas Hawksmoor took commissions in the city to design masterpieces for the university. Growing up in Oxford, Buckland witnessed the construction of notable buildings like the Radcliffe Camera, and you can see this image in the corresponding blog, and that was begun in 1737 by architect James Gibbs, who was well versed, of course, in the architect Andrea Palladio. Now, Palladio went back to classical designs from ancient Greece and Rome to write his 4 books of architecture. This book has become the most widely distributed book on architecture in history. Unlike other college buildings at Oxford, the camera that have high walls, Gibbs' Radcliffe Camera stands out as one of the most public buildings in Oxford, and it's in a square where you can see it's visible at all angles. So Buckland certainly saw this building and may have even met architect James Gibbs as a youth. Though the camera does not contain a Gibbs surround, this was likely one of the earliest instances that Buckland saw Gibbs' work. Gibbs would continue to influence Buckland throughout his career. From a young age, Buckland likely saw the influence of Gibbs' work penetrate beyond the city of Oxford. It is impossible to say how much the Buckland family traveled in the formative years of William's development. However, it is probable that his parents took him to visit their hometown of Burford, England, just under 20 miles to the west of Oxford. In Burford, Buckland would have seen the home of lawyer John Jordan, and there's a picture in the blog, which was completed in 1730, just 4 years after he was born. This structure, now the Burford Methodist Church, contains rusticated doorway, and that's in the front of the building, and it's in the style of James Gibbs' work, Gibbs Surround. Despite other options available to Buckland, he chose the life of a craftsman, likely inspired by the architecture he saw in his youth. At age 14 in 1748, he signed a 7-year apprenticeship with his uncle, a skilled joiner in London. Here in London, he saw a city rising from the ashes after the Great Fire of 1666. Neoclassical or new classical buildings modeled on ancient antiquity were being built in the city, like the Mansion House, which was built from 1739 to 1752, the Horse Guards in Whitehall, which was built from 1750 to 1758, and James Gibbs' West Block of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, which was built from 1743 to 1753. Buckland certainly saw these structures and may have even worked on them. Now, things changed for Buckland after his apprenticeship. In August of 1755, he was 21 years old, and he signed a 4-year indenture to serve Virginia politician George Mason, and he served him as a carpenter and joiner. And he received a free passage, food, lodging, and an annual salary of £20, so much, much better than the average indentured servant. He certainly had skills. Mason was building a substantial brick mansion on the Potomac River about 10 miles south of Alexandria called Gunston Hall, and you can see this image in the blog. At Gunston Hall, Buckland incorporated British elements, including a Gothic porch from British architect Batty Langley's book, a Palladian parlor, and a Chinoiserie Chippendale dining room. During his time at Gunston, from 1755 to 1759, he became familiar with the surrounding area and, of course, the neighbors, as he married Mary Moore, the daughter of a nearby plantation owner. He almost certainly saw a queer church just 25 miles to the south, that it contains a doorway in the style of a Gibbs Surround. The church was begun in 1751 and completed in 1755, and there's an image of that in the blog, by the Virginia architect Morning Richards. Unfortunately, it burned in 1755, and over the next 2 years, Richard rebuilt the structure, completing it in 1757. Now, in colonial Virginia, parishes were spread out, so a queer parish was considered a neighbor to Gunston Hall. The sandstone for the coined exterior on Gunston Hall actually came from nearby Aquia Creek. Buckland's employer, George Mason, had strong ties to the church as he grew up in that parish, and he was very close friends with the minister John Moncure. In fact, he was godparent to Moncure's children and vice versa. It is probable that Mason visited the church during the construction and brought his young craftsman William Buckland, newly arrived from London in the summer of 1755. Mason trusted Buckland's expertise, as seen in a 20th century restoration of Gunston Hall, which revealed a wooden board with sketches for the courthouse. Buckland had been asked by Mason to sketch out a courthouse design because Mason was charged with designing the courthouse at Dumfries. So Buckland took out a board, did a small sketch. Buckland then showed Mason, and later on it was incorporated into the very walls of Gunston Hall, and it wasn't found until the 20th century. So it's clear that Mason valued Buckland's opinion, and he would have been curious to take Buckland to the church, to Aquia Church, for his observations. At the construction site of the church, Buckland would have witnessed the building of the Gibbs Surround door and probably would have spoken with architect Morning Richards about this feature. After 4 years at Gunston, Mason gave Buckland an admirable recommendation, and Buckland started a furniture shop with William Bernard Sears, whom he had met while in the employ of George Mason. Sears later designed a chimney at George Washington's Mount Vernon based on a design from the British architect Abraham Swan. So you could see, what type of status with the craftsmen that Buckland was working with. In addition to making furniture, Buckland also worked on Virginia estate interiors like Colonel John Taylor's Mount Airy and public buildings like a courthouse for Prince William County. Though his public buildings do not survive, estates like Mount Airy, Sabine Hall, and Minokin still exist and all have some original material, including rusticated sandstone elements, like a style of a Gibbs surround. Sabine Hall contains a Gibbs surround window, in the style of James Gibbs, of course, and the south facade on Mount Airy is copied from Gibbs' Book of Architecture. Now, it's difficult to say what role Buckland played in the development of each house, if any. However, it is certain he recognized the connection to Gibbs' works, whether it was his hand or not. In 1771, Buckland came to Annapolis, Maryland to work for a very wealthy man, Edward Lloyd IV, called Edward the Magnificent by his friends. At Lloyd's home in Annapolis, Buckland oversaw the interiors and created 2 Palladian windows, blind niches, and elaborate carvings in the public spaces. Annapolis at the time was enjoying a prosperous golden age where architecture was used to advance status. In 1774, Maryland planter Matthias Hammond hired Buckland to design his entire house, and you can see an image in the blog, across the street from that of Edward Lloyd IV, so they would be direct neighbors. In the early 1770s, Buckland had one of the most extensive architectural libraries in the American colonies, comprising of 14 works, including Gibbs' Book of Architecture, which contained the Gibbs surround design. Buckland did not own Andrea Palladio's 4 books of architecture, so he borrowed it from his client Edward Lloyd IV to look at inspiration from Matthias Hammond's house. The design he chose for Hammond's house is a 5-part Anglo-Palladian villa, modeled after Palladio's Villa Pisani, which still exists in the Veneto area of Italy today. The term Anglo-Palladian means the English interpretation of Palladio's works, which began with English architect Indigo Jones in the 17th century. The Villa Pisani features blind niches exactly like the Hammond-Harwood house. In the Hammond-Harwood house, Buckland pays homage to Gibbs and includes several of his designs, most notably the Gibbs surround window in the stair hall, which provides ample lighting. There's also a round window in the pediment, which is from Gibbs' Book of Architecture. So you can see he's using it over and over again to look at the book design, the Gibbs surround and others. Now, the Gibbs surround at the Hammond-Harwood house is made from southern pine, not stone. However, its rustication has tricked many casual viewers to make it seem like it does look like stone. Similarly, George Washington's Mount Vernon is also made of southern pine, but great care was taken to coat the exterior with paint and a queer sand to look like stone. During the construction of the Hammond-Harwood house in the spring of 1774, Buckland began to sit for a portrait, and you can see that image in the blog. And the portrait was done by his friend, the noted Annapolis-raised artist, Charles Willson Peale, who lived from 1741 to 1827. Unfortunately, Buckland died in 1774 at age 40, before the completion of the Hammond-Harwood house, and when just the head was finished of his portrait. The portrait was not finished until 13 years later when Peale, the artist, was back in Annapolis completing portraits for Buckland's daughter, Sarah Callahan, and her family. Peale felt like the Callahans significantly overpaid him. So as a gift, he finished the portrait of his deceased friend, Sarah Callahan's father, William Buckland. It is interesting to note the background of the portrait. Peale includes architect James Gibbs' most celebrated work, St. Martin's in the Field in London, with the iconic Gibbs surrounds. It is unknown whether Buckland had requested the building to be in the background, or Peale chose to include the church based on conversations with Buckland, because of course Buckland was deceased at this time. So he either remembered it, or Buckland had specifically asked for it. Regardless, it's clear that this edifice and its design had a profound effect on our architect, enough for it to be included in the only known likeness of him. So why did Buckland include the Gibbs surround window into the Hammond-Harwood house? I believe he was paying homage to the architect who first inspired his architectural career. This development began by witnessing the erection of Gibbs' Radcliffe camera during his youth in Oxford, and by seeing the influence of Gibbs in his parents' hometown of Burford, England, and by viewing Gibbs' work in London, of course, too. In the colonies, his love for Gibbs grew by viewing the influence of Gibbs at a queer church and incorporating elements into his own designs. The work of James Gibbs and William Buckland is inextricably linked and have stood the test of time in stone, brick, and mortar. Recently, the Gibbs surround window has been conserved at the Hammond-Harwood House as part of our 2020 window restoration project, which is very exciting. We got a grant from Maryland Historical Trust, and we were able to restore all the windows in our beautiful historic house museum. I hope that next time you visit the Hammond-Harwood House, you can see the Gibbs surround window. We also have a copy of the Buckland portrait. The original is at Yale, and we have the originals of the Callahan family by Charles Wilson Peale. So you can see our architect's daughter and grandchildren and son-in-law. So that's it for now, and I will be back next week or the week after to deliver more research through our YouTube series. Thank you so much.